Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our second session of Sunoikisis's Digital Classics Summer Semester 2021. So today is our second session, and we have a session about teaching epigraphy in a pandemic. Today we have, three guests, Alice Bencivenni, Irene Vagionakis from the University of Bologna, and Gabriel Bodard from the Institute of Classical Studies, London. And the reason for this session, of course, we are still in this pandemic, in a crisis, and we wanted to teach, or at least to present a session showing different programs that different courses in epigraphy taught during the pandemic. But first of all, we have to say that these programs, these courses were developed in the past, so before the pandemic, and not just for the pandemic. So today we will see different courses, and Sunoikis itself was developed 5 years ago in order to use digital technologies for teaching, learning, researching classics using digital technologies, and also to offer the possibility to reach a wide audience. But of course, thanks to the pandemic, we're in a difficult situation, but thanks to the pandemic, we could experiment even more with teaching in general classics online. And given that we have interesting programs for teaching epigraphy, today we wanted to collect these experiences and present them. And in fact, and now I'm just to briefly share my screen. Maybe a second, okay. Okay, so here you can see the class outline in GitHub. You know that we use GitHub for sharing descriptions of our sessions and also for sharing resources. So the goal of this session is to present recent experiences of epigraphy courses taught during the pandemic. And these courses are taught at the Institute of Classical Studies in London and the University of Bologna, where we have a very interesting project, the ENCODE project, funded by Erasmus Plus Strategic Partnership for Higher Education. And again, the goal of this project is really to try to develop a program for teaching students how to study ancient writing. So this is a project, again, developed before the pandemic and not for a pandemic, but to experiment with new ways of using the technologies for teaching epigraphy. And today we will see three main case studies: a master course in Greek epigraphy, a digital Greek and Latin epigraphy workshop taught in a synchronous way, and then an epidoc workshop taught mainly asynchronously. Now, as usual, we have readings also for this session, where you can learn more about teaching and learning digital epigraphy, and then also how to use the TI guidelines in general, and also for epidoc for epigraphy. We have various resources here, so you can find links to these courses for teaching epigraphy. These courses developed at the University of Bologna and in London, so you have the links. And then finally, as usual, we have also an exercise that will be commented later by our guests. But now I can go back to StreamYard, and we know that we have an audience on YouTube, so please ask questions through YouTube. Any questions you have, we will try to answer, of course. We can follow your questions in the chat, and we will answer during the presentation or after. So we will have about 25 or 30 minutes for answering your questions. But I think that now we can start. Gabriel Bodard will start with a short introduction in general to epigraphy and digital epigraphy. What do we mean today by epigraphy and digital epigraphy? So, Gabriel, thank you for joining again today. And okay, I think okay, you can start.
Great, thank you, Monica. If you want to put up my slides, I'll just talk for a couple of minutes. I really want to just put into context what the rest of the presenters today are going to, and myself a bit later, are going to be talking about. Let's just say we're talking about epigraphy, digital epigraphy, and teaching digital epigraphy, and I just didn't want to start with the assumption that everybody immediately knows exactly what those things are and exactly what we mean by those things. So firstly, what do we mean by epigraphy? In simple terms, epigraphy is anything written on a durable surface in the ancient world. But what's interesting about epigraphy is that what we have here, and it's similar disciplines as well, like papyrology and others, is we have texts in the actual handwriting of the ancients, and this is a really a quite unique phenomenon. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of inscriptions, probably millions of ancient inscriptions, and hundreds of thousands of papyri. So they're not unique in that sense. There's lots and lots and lots of them. But the fact that we have the ancients' handwriting, and these texts tend to be the vast majority of them are one-off texts that don't exist in multiple copies. So they give us very, very interesting insights into the text of the ancient world. They include things like graffiti and ostraca, things inscribed on really temporary and reused, recycled objects. And as a result, they're often very fragmentary. And one of the things that epigraphy and disciplines like papyrology and so forth are really concerned about is not only what the text says, not just transcribing it and reading it and looking at it, but recording the state of the text. So for epigraphy and papyrology, this set of conventions called the Leiden Conventions have come into existence gradually over the years. They were codified in 1930, but they've continued to evolve. And this really is one of the main disciplinary cornerstones of epigraphy, is these very clear conventions, which include these sorts of sigla, but also include things like conventions in terms of the order in which we write things, and so forth, that help us to understand editions of these very, very important but very, very fragile and often fragmentary texts. So when we talk about digital epigraphy, we're often but not always talking about epidoc, which is a set of encoding standards for recording epigraphic, papyrological, sigillographic, numismatic, and other ancient original texts of this kind in digital form. And this is a collection of scholarly standards that has been in development for about 20 or so years. And it very much bases the digital standards on prior art of academic standards. So the Leiden distinctions for how you transcribe the text, this XML language called TEI, which has been in development since the 1980s for encoding both the transcription and the descriptive information about text-bearing objects. The various databases and other publication standards for recording all of this descriptive information, and input not only from epigraphy but from all sorts of other disciplines and other languages and other periods of history and other geographical areas that record ancient original texts in the same way. So all of this has gone into developing this set of standards which we're talking about here. And these are the main tools that are part of the Epidoc tool set. They're a set of guidelines explaining how you encode any given feature. There's a set of style sheets which will take the XML that you're encoding this way and will turn it into an example of the sort of display you would want to see. There's a schema to help you be consistent within this. There's a publication tool called FS to help you view your results, and there's a wealth of third-party tools that have been developed for working with Epidoc and for epigraphic and papyrological and other kinds of information as well. And my final note, just as we're going to be talking about teaching digital epigraphy, just to say, up until a year ago, when we were teaching epidoc and digital epigraphy, most often in face-to-face contexts, in classrooms, in seminar rooms, and so forth, we had various types of training that were offered. So we had designed many resources for these week-long workshops, which usually had somewhere in the region of 20 or 25 participants, where we taught encoding, we taught processing, we taught publication, we talked about project workflow. There were classes on Epidoc in the context of a history module, a single class within a 12-week course on epigraphy, for example. And we had taught Epidoc many times in Sunoikis Digital Classics, in these sorts of sessions where we had these online tutorials, which were usually accompanied by a practical seminar or a lab session where the exercise that we offered at the end was performed. There's been this program of Epidoc workshops has been running for at least 15 years now, and so there's a lot of materials that already exist that are used in this sort of teaching, and the parallels between teaching Epidoc and teaching epigraphy in the more traditional way have been pointed out several times. That there's an assumption of basic knowledge, there's the introduction of new, very technical knowledge, there's the use of reference materials and customized summaries, and the main part of this teaching and learning process has been exercise and practice in both cases. So that's as much as I want to say, sort of by way of background. That's where we are, and that's where we would have been now if we hadn't spent the last 14 months sort of semi-isolated by this pandemic. So that's really the starting point. So I think I'll hand over to Alice to take us to where we're going next.
Okay, Gabby, thank you very much for this introduction to epigraphy and digital epigraphy. And now, okay, Alice. Okay, here we are. Okay, Alice, thank you.
Maybe I can share my slides now.
Yes, I can start by sharing. Okay, here we have your slides. Okay.
So as you said, Monica, this session is about teaching epigraphy in the pandemic, and we are about to talk about some recent experiences in the field. Let me say at the beginning that on the whole, you will witness a sort of progression through the experiences and 3 case studies provided in our narrative. In the first part of this session, I would like to introduce the ENCODE project. Then we will discuss some experiences of epigraphy courses taught during the last months in the frame of the project and in the emergency of the pandemic. In particular, I will deal later with a Master Greek epigraphy course taught in October 2020. So let's start with the ENCODE project. As Monica said before, ENCODE is a 3-year Erasmus Plus strategic partnership for higher education project, which started in September 2020, funded with support from the European Union. It aims at bridging the existing gap in the teaching and learning domain of ancient writing cultures between the humanistic training and the now essential digital competencies required for study, research, and employment. It brings together 6 partners universities, Bologna, Würzburg, Leuven, Parma, Hamburg, and Oslo, and also some outstanding associated partners in the field of digital humanities, epigraphy, and papyrology. ENCODE aims at the following results. The first, shared definition of needed digital competencies of graduate students in the programs focusing on written cultural heritage, and the design and test of innovative and customizable teaching modules, a full guide to the teaching modules themselves, including a MOOC, and a platform for alumni community and stakeholders, employers. The platform will help in assuring a constant and dynamic contact among the different actors involved. The project has a schedule of 7 main planned events, conferences, and workshops devoted to specific topics. Here's the outline of the events. As you can see, the project is at its beginning, and only the first event already took place in January. Planned events are designed to focus on a specific topic related to the digital treatment of written ancient artifacts, and at the same time to apply that topic to a defined typology of written artifacts. This structure aims at promoting collaborative intercultural digital approaches to ancient written heritage, at strengthening the cooperation between higher education and cultural heritage institutions, supplying materials for teaching and self-training to academics, and at meeting learning needs of graduates in the field of highly specialized digital skills applied to the study of ancient writing media in old European, Asian, and African languages. This project is obviously not longing to reinvent the wheel. It is firmly grounded in the research training experiences of other transnational initiatives, some of which already involve team members of the partners' organizations or associated partners. It primarily relies on the transnational epidoc community and also considers experiences of other transnational initiatives such as papyri.info, the Digital Corpus of Literary Papyri, Trismegistos, Eagle, and last but not least, the precious long-standing experience and teaching groundbreaking expertise of SunoikisisDC. Before talking about the first ENCODE January event, I would like to talk a little about what happened in October 2020 during the regular Master Greek Epigraphy course I teach at the Department of History and Culture in Bologna. At the University of Bologna, there is a long tradition of epigraphic courses, which dates back to 1972-73 for Greek epigraphy, 73-74 for Roman epigraphy. And from 2011, it has been established also a tradition of epidoc and Leiden Plus workshops, which continues to these days. 7 intensive epidoc workshops have been held since then. These workshops are regularly held as activities not included in the curricula of master courses, but as additional training activities which students can choose. But they are also open to a wider public. The pandemic canceled the chance for a 2020 event, but an unexpected opportunity to go epidoc arose in autumn during the regular course of Greek epigraphy for master students as a consequence of the pandemic itself. During that course, I usually focus on editing Greek inscriptions. Students, regardless of their previous experience with ancient Greek or epigraphy, are required to practice in editing 2 editions of inscriptions during the course itself. In the first part of the course, the training consists in learning how to edit an inscription written in one of the local scripts of archaic Greece. Students work on a digital image or facsimile of the text. They make a diplomatic and critic transcription of it. They translate it into Italian, and they are asked to search as many details as possible regarding support, historical context, and previous editions. In the second part, I usually guide the students through the rooms of the Archaeological Museum in Bologna, where they are invited to study the inscriptions on display and to practice surveying, reading, copying, and editing. Obviously, this second part and exercise was not possible this year because museums were closed and not all the students were actually following the course in the flesh. A great majority of them was connected via Microsoft Teams platform. This emergency situation affected also the first part of the course. Research activity on inscriptions written in local scripts was not easy to carry on for students who were following the course from home with no access to the university libraries, even though libraries were in fact open at that time. Not all the resources useful for this kind of research are available online, and some of them, as the SunoikisisDC website, are sometimes unavailable due to technical issues. Anyway, difficulties for this first part were mainly overcome by collaborative work among students and materials supplied by the teacher. As an alternative to the museum session anyway, the only feasible solution was to go digital. I decided then to devote a slot of 6 hours in the second part of the course to epidoc and digital editing of inscriptions. With the help of Irene Vagionakis, 3 lessons of 2 hours each were devoted to a general introduction to epidoc, basic XML rules and how to encode the bibliography, epidoc guidelines for text transcription and how to use Oxygen Editor, and epidoc guidelines for indexing and guided exercises. The students were then required to work on their own. They had to transform into a digital edition the critical edition already drafted during the first part of the course, focusing only on bibliography and text transcription. We used as teaching material, in addition to the guidelines themselves, the slide presentations available at the Epidoc Workshops wiki page, suggesting to search for help there in case of necessity. And of course, we supplied the Epidoc Start Pack. Overall, they succeeded in accomplishing the task at a very basic level, as said, only basic text transcription and bibliography. Out of 20 students who followed the first part of the course, drafting the traditional edition, 18 were able to produce the digital version of it. One failed for medical reason, the other simply disappeared. As attested by an anonymous feedback form devoted to this digital experience, which was filled by 10 out of 18 students at the end of the course itself, none of them have heard about epidoc before the course. Considering that they had to get acquainted with epidoc and Oxygen Editor without having had the chance of expressing a particular willing to do so, as conversely happens when someone freely applies for an epidoc workshop, the overall success of the experience may be taken for granted. But if we want to draw useful conclusions from the teaching training point of view, we may certainly note that this very intensive course, 4 hours, if we keep the introduction apart, was really a shot in the dark in the premises and in the outcomes. As a matter of fact, among 18 students who produced their first epidoc edition during the course, only 7 were able to push the digital edition a little bit forward, solving some problems and trying to find a place for each part of the edition inside the structure template, though not always encoding it. More interestingly, by now, only 2 out of the 11 students of the course who already took the final examination decided to draft, along with the traditional edition of an inscription required for the exam, an XML edition of the same stone. These 2 students, maybe significantly, took the exam at the first date available 1 month after the end of the course. Even though this XML edition was not mandatory for the final exam, and considering that they have Oxygen editor for free as students of the University of Bologna, I would have expected a greater exploitation of the XML skills acquired. The more so because in the same anonymous feedback form cited before, 90% expressed the opinion that digital training has plenty to do with humanities. 80% expressed the opinion that digital epigraphy is essential for research activity in the field of ancient written sources, and 100% firmly believe that digital skills may make a difference for their future career, research, teaching, and job. In conclusion, I may add that it would have been useful and more meaningful to draw a conclusion from 18 answers rather than from only 10, and maybe also to be able to distinguish between the answers of the students who had the training in classroom and the ones that followed the course via Microsoft Teams, but we weren't able to do that. Overall, as emphasized by 2 responses I read in the Unibo questionnaires concerning the evaluation of the whole epigraphy course made by students, let's say that this experience has been too compressed. Even if we shouldn't definitely dismiss digital epigraphy because, as a student wrote, it rejuvenates epigraphy itself, a sentence which recalls the famous dictum by Louis Robert, epigraphy is l'eau de jouvence for the ancient historian. Irene, please.
Alice, thank you very much also for your statistics and also for these comments. I think we will be able to come back to these things later. But now, Irene, so I think that, okay, we are using the same slides. I think that Irene can go on. Okay. Irene, your microphone is muted.
Sorry for this.
No problem. Okay, excellent. Okay.
So thank you for also for telling me about the microphone. So I was saying that now we are going to consider another case, which is the Encode Digital Greek and Latin Epigraphy workshop, which took place virtually in Bologna this January. And this was the first workshop organized in the framework of the ENCODE project, and at my knowledge also the first in-depth week-long epidoc workshop that has been organized since the beginning of the COVID outbreak. And in this case, our attempt was that of reproducing as closely as possible an in-person workshop. So in this perspective, we had the same amount of workshop hours as in the previous in-person workshops, and we had, in a synchronous way, both the teaching and the training sessions. We have used Zoom for this, and in particular, we have been using the Zoom breakout rooms for the training sessions. And so being synchronous, it was based on Central Europe time zone. And as in previous workshops, it had a limited number of participants. So unfortunately, we had to choose only 25 out of the 77 applications that we received. And as for the trainers, we had 4 or 5 trainers, depending on the days of the workshop. And the main innovation from a structure point of view was the division in groups for the training sessions of the participants, as I said, using the Zoom breakout rooms. And it was not completely an innovation, because its aim was that of trying to reproduce the groups that we usually have in classroom among people who sit close to each other. And it was a way for handling better the training, correction, and training supervision during the exercises. So, considering the overall workshop structure, it was a kind of week-long workshop. It was 4 days long, from Tuesday to Friday, and it was preceded by the ENCODE project conference on Monday. And as for the times of teaching and training every day, we had 6 hours per day, 3 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, and this was very similar to what we used to have also in previous workshop. I've listed in this slide some of the previous programs of the workshop that we had in Bologna. So we always had workshops from 3 to 4.5 days, and the amount of hours per day was from 6 to 8. And of course, when we had more hours, we had longer breaks. So again, it was very, very similar to what we used to do before. And as for the program, so we had 4 days, and this time we dedicated the first day to the epigraphic database Roma, epigraphic conventions and way of input materials on their database. And then we moved towards epidoc. So we had on the second day an introduction to semantic markup, epidoc TI, XML, and exercises with an XML editor, Oxygen. And then we had an introduction of the epidoc guidelines, especially on the descriptive and historical data and on the text transcription part. Then the following day, we focused on the guidelines section about the vocabularies and indexing terms, and we practiced with the transformation in Oxygen through the XSLT style sheets. And in this case, on this day, we had an open conference about the Venice Quiz project, and similarly, at the beginning of the last day, we had another open conference, this time about the Lingue Culture dell'Italia Antica project. And on the last day, we also had a part on tools for online XML publishing, especially FS, and a last part on the Leiden Plus markup language, so not strictly epidoc, by using the papari.info platform. So as for the teaching material, we have used the same types of teaching tools that we did in-person workshops. So mainly we based our teaching on the epidoc guidelines as main source of reference, and we had been using the slides available on the epidoc workshops digital classicist wiki page, as also we did in the October experience. And we had a shared folder on Google Drive with some materials specific for the workshop, so some Google Doc file with the programs and links to useful resources, and the so-called Epidoc Start Pack, which is a zipped folder including the Epidoc schema, the style sheets, the template, and an Oxygen project, which help the participants using XML files inside Oxygen, having everything displayed in the project section tab. Then the pack includes also some PDFs that we have been using even before. Those are some quick reference files which are available also from the epidoc guidelines homepage, and some guidance about how to perform the Oxygen XSLT transformations. And inside it, we included some exercises, some files in XML for doing the exercises, which were arranged in separated folders for each session. So we had prepared materials for every type of different exercise that the participants had to do. And also in this case, we received the feedback. We asked for a feedback from the trainers, from the trainees, and we gave them 2 questionnaires as Google Forms, and we had an anonymous feedback questionnaire, and of the 25 participants, 24 of them answered to that questionnaire. And then we also gave them another competence questionnaire, which was filled in by almost all of them, by 23 of them. And this one has had a lot to do with ENCODE aims, because we wanted to discover more about what the participants thought about their competencies, both on the humanistic front and in the digital one. And this questionnaire was based for the humanistic competence part on the Kalohi framework, for the humanities and history, and for the digital competencies, it was based on the DigiComp framework. And I won't talk much about the competence, but just on the competence questionnaire, but just to give you an idea of what kind of answers we received from this. I'm displaying in this slide the part relevant to the ability of creating and editing XML digital content. So most of them declare to have a very basic knowledge of this before the training, and almost all of them have raised their abilities, their competencies, saying that after the training they achieved a focused or even an advanced level of knowledge of this specific part of this specific digital competence. But more interesting for our purposes here is the feedback questionnaire that we gave them, and 75% of them declared to be very satisfied by the workshop. And in this feedback questionnaire from it, we received a lot of interesting suggestions, which were referring both to pros and cons, both to appreciated parts and to things that they would have suggested to do differently. So generally, what they said was that the program was very intense, and they would have suggested a less intense daily program, possibly to be spread over 2 weeks. And they suggested us to have more breaks during the sessions because they were, again, very intense. And although they appreciated the practice part of the workshop, which is a constant in the Epidoc workshops, they are very practical, but they would have suggested to have to spend even more time on exercises. And some of them, in order to be able to do more practice during the workshop, suggested us to provide them some preparatory material in advance, so that more time can be spent on the exercises. And this is not specific to this digital online workshop, but we had a similar feedback also in the past. They would have preferred to have a kind of introduction on some very basic concepts and terminology of the digital humanities or IT world. Also, they appreciated the fact of having been divided in small groups, but they would have preferred even smaller groups to be more followed during the training than we did. And they would have also liked to have some work-through exercises together. So not just show them how things work, but do a complete exercise together, so that they would have known how to do thereafter. And we have also a specific question on open conferences, and they were appreciated generally, and they say that they give insight into existing projects and a different view on the digital humanities. And many of them say that they could be considered very helpful breaks during the very intense sessions. But some of them, again, the ones who wanted to spend more time on practice, say that, okay, they were nice, but we could have used that time to do even more practice. So considering overall both the feedback deriving from the trainees and also our trainers' feedback, those are the main pros and cons that we have been able to notice in a remote approach. So first, I'm going to talk briefly about pros and cons of a remote approach, and then specifically to the remote synchronous approach. So generally, a remote approach has been positive because it simplified a lot things, because there was no need to travel, and so we received many more applications from abroad or from other cities in Italy. And it has been proven easier to organize for us, because we didn't have to think about providing insurances to or credentials for the internet connection to the students, neither reimbursements, and not even having to organize coffee breaks. So it was much easier to organize. But of course, there are some general cons, which are that there were no socializing or networking or even chatting moments, which are one of the nicest part of the in-person workshops, considering that the participants come from different parts of Italy or of the world. So it is very nice to have the possibility to be together and socialize. And a second very major con is that there were too many screen hours and too many, in this particular case, too many consecutive screen hours. So let's consider now the pros and cons of a synchronous approach. So it has the advantage compared to an asynchronous approach, as we're going to see in a while. It has the advantage of giving continuously supervised practical training, and this was one of the most appreciated parts of the workshop. So all the trainers were always there during the entire practical training. And the fact of being connected online all together gave a kind of sense of closeness, again, compared to an asynchronous approach. But of course, it has as main disadvantage the fact of having too many consecutive screen hours. So even if we had some breaks, they were too few compared to the amount of hours, and it was really exhausting. So the program wasn't really too much intense, but it felt to be very more intense than usual, even if it wasn't, probably because of the screen factor. So the fact of being so many hours, so many consecutive hours in front of a screen proved to be very exhausting, both for trainees and trainers. And this was nothing new compared to old in-person workshops, but it was not fitting all time zones. It was addressed mainly for European participants, as we had sessions both in the morning and in the afternoon. And now I leave the floor to Gabriel to talk about the London-Bologna Epidoc workshop that we had last week, in this case with an asynchronous approach.
Okay, thank you, Irene. And now, Gabi, so I think you are using the same slides. That's correct?
No, I'm not. I'm not using.
No, sorry.
I'll share my screen in a minute.
Okay, okay, sorry.
No, that's cool. So yeah, I want to talk just for a few minutes about the online Epidoc workshop, the asynchronous version that Irene and I taught a couple of weeks ago now, with a lot of help from various other people, including Alice and others. The main difference with this was that we decided, partly learning from the feedback that you received from the Encode workshop, and partly based on several years of experience that we'd had working with Sunoikisis and similar programs for asynchronous online teaching, we decided to completely steer away from this idea of having several hours per day contact time in this. So if you share my screen just now, Monica, I'll just quickly show the program to this workshop. So what we had in this workshop was 1 hour basically per day of contact time, which on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday were live sessions where we discussed with the participants how things were going and what we wanted them to do next. We then gave them several hours of video tutorials that they could watch. So we had some essential tutorials that were relatively short, and then we had all of these further optional tutorials that they could dig deeper and view these. So these were all delivered on YouTube, and there's a whole channel of these videos now. There are, I guess, does it tell us how many there are? I forget how many videos we have in total, but it's like, what, 30, 35, 40 videos that we produced for the purposes of this. And then based on these tutorials, we asked them to choose some inscriptions, and we gave them some pointers and to do some exercises. So they took this is not a picture of one of them doing an exercise, but they used Oxygen, and they did their own markup using Epidoc, using what they'd learned in the videos, much like this, to do various exercises. And then and we also made available the slides that were used in those videos, so they could have very quick access to them, and also access to pages that they could copy and paste from, links that they could click on, etc., which they can't do in YouTube videos. And then in the program, after they'd attempted the first set of exercises for a few hours between the Monday and the Tuesday morning, they then had various live question and answer sessions that they could come along, a few at a time. Because we had a much larger cohort, we decided not to turn anybody away from this workshop. So we had 52 people registered for this workshop, and this was not a free workshop. So these were all people who had decided to pay to receive Epidoc training. And so we broke them down into small groups of 7 or 8 per group, and this is where Irene and I did not do all the heavy lifting. Alice and Martina Filosa and Scott Di Giulio helped us out very much with running these live sessions. And in these sessions, students were able to ask questions and show examples of their work and get direct, immediate one-on-one feedback on what they were doing. And you know, people ask questions on things like project management and further things that they might want to learn, publication and so forth, as well as, you know, how do I mark up this particular feature in Epidoc XML? In between the live sessions, we tried to replicate the slightly more social aspect of sitting in a classroom with a bunch of other students, where the tutors can wander around and ask questions immediately. But even if there isn't anyone close by to answer questions, you can talk to and discuss a problem with the person next to you. We in attempting to replicate this, we set up a bunch of forums using the GitHub issue tracker for discussion of various issues that came up, and these were reasonably well used. Irene will talk a bit about some feedback on these and how well these went down. But people in here were able to ask very, very minor questions, but also much more major questions and they were able to comment on each other's questions as well as waiting for answers from us. We also offered them the opportunity for more engaged and in-depth questions, and in particular for questions that we didn't necessarily have an answer to yet, to use the epidoc markup list, which is a list for discussion of the markup of ancient texts, where epidoc is discussed very widely, and you know, any question there would be welcome, including questions from students. So that was something we also made available to them. And so between all of those features, we had I think pretty much all of the elements that we would normally have had in a face-to-face workshop, but without this rather grinding 6 hours a day of screen time, which you know, my massive admiration to Alice and Irene and their colleagues for running that in January. I don't think I could have. Spending, you know, 6 hours staring at a screen in a day, having to be alert and engage with students on it, I think would be almost terminal. So this I think provided all these features. It wasn't entirely without issue. There were some issues. There were technical issues which were much harder to fix when you can't lean over and reach the keyboard of the person you're talking to. There were issues with time zones. There were some people who you know, by lunchtime, our time, it was their basically the end of their day, and they had to go to bed, and so most of the time when they were working was before we got up in the morning, and so there was you know, that was even more asynchronous than we'd intended it to be. There were issues with different expectations and different levels of competency being addressed simultaneously. From people who knew exactly what they wanted to do, which was a bunch of inscriptions in a language that none of us as instructors had ever seen before, to people who were there so much out of interest and to broaden their horizons that when we said, oh, just pick an inscription you're interested in, that they wanted more steerage than that. They wanted us to give them an inscription to work on. So there was a really wide range of stuff, but that's always the case. And in you know, in a classroom, you spot that more quickly, and you can address that. So there was a little bit of time lag between these issues. So in one or two cases, there were people who didn't really get started until Wednesday because the issues they had starting took much longer to fix, whereas, you know, in a classroom we'd have seen that happening, and in an hour they'd have been fixed. So some things worked very well, some things were less easy for us to address. You see at the bottom of this program, we started to add some notes about things that had gone wrong, and that, you know, we needed to remind people how to fix or or where to find things. So there were some issues. But I think long story short, as it were, the most of the features that we would have delivered in a classroom situation were delivered through here, and in some cases better. Because in a classroom, what we would have done, at least the ones we've done in London in the past, the Bologna ones, I think, will have had, you know, slightly different strategies in some of these approaches. But we would spend 5 hours a day in the classroom. We would spend about a third of that time speaking. We would give these various presentations, some of them with slides, some of them with live demonstrations in an XML editor, and so forth. And in between these presentations, we would get them working on technical issues. We'd wander around and help. We'd make sure everybody was able to do the basic things before we presented the next bunch of presentations on the more advanced features, and so forth. So it really was it would have been, you know, real time, and we had to make sure everyone's up to speed. So a lot of those features, such as being able to see visually when someone's struggling, and being able to answer a question immediately, and being able to reach over to someone's keyboard and show them what's going on, what we weren't able to do. But issues then of people working at different speeds, people being able to watch the videos in their own time, sort out that they understood those things before they moved on to the next things that can only be done asynchronously. Those turned out to be better, and I think, and I'll hand over to Irene in a second, who's going to talk a bit about feedback and the real pros and cons of these approaches. But I think even when in some mythical future we're all teaching in classrooms again, I will keep some of the things that we've learned from this sort of practice, and we will do some sort of hybrid asynchronous activity, even in a real time, in-person training workshop of this kind. But over to Irene for feedback.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me? I'm not.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So also in the London-Bologna workshop, we asked the trainees for feedback on the last day. Well, at Wednesday, in the central day of the workshop, and at the very end of the workshop on Friday. And we, as we have been experimenting new materials and new approaches, we specifically asked for feedback on the different parts of the different methods that we adopted. So starting from the videos and the slideshows, generally the videos were very appreciated. It was one of the most appreciated parts of the workshop, because they say that they could watch the videos more than once, and many of them did. And of course, they could stop them, pause them, and start over, and they could watch them with as many breaks as they wanted. So this helped regarding the amount of continuous screen hours. And they also appreciated the fact of having the choice between watching them all or just a part of them. So we say them that some of the videos were very important and fundamental, but some others could be watched only if they were interested in a specific topic, and they could skip them if not. And they appreciated this because this matched different levels of learning. So the ones who were interested in having just a basic introduction to epidoc and to digital epigraphy watched the basic ones, and many of them watched all the videos because they wanted to. And as for the exercises, they were mostly unproblematic, but they would have liked to have also some walkthrough live exercises, as in the Bologna workshop. In this case, or in the ENCODE January Bologna workshop. In this case, we had some walkthrough videos, but probably they would have preferred also to have at least one of them live, so that could interrupt and ask directly for questions immediately, without having to wait for posting questions to the forums later, or waiting until the next Q&A session. And this is not specific to the asynchronous approach, but just to record, they also would have preferred to have a selection of recommended exercises with an appropriate level of complexity. So not just to have the total freedom of choosing whichever descriptions they wanted, and they would have liked to have been more, to have more indications on what to do precisely. And let's consider now the forums, which apparently were the most problematic of the approaches that we adopted, because many of the trainees said that the interface was quite unfamiliar to them, and they struggle a bit, at least at the beginning, with having to understand how GitHub was working, how the issue tracker was working. And this is why we had a mid-workshop quick feedback session. And thanks to this, we had been able to change slightly the way in which the questions could have been asked on GitHub. So in the beginning, we had prepared a selection, I don't remember, but several, 6, 7 issues related to specific wide topics. For example, there was one issue, a ticket opened on FS, another one on the transcription part, another one on bibliography and indexing. But they it turned out that they preferred to being able to open a new ticket, a new issue for every new question they had. So it was even easier for us for being able to understand immediately which was the question from the heading, from the title of the issue, instead of having all of them inside the same thread. And so they would have preferred also to have a quick demonstration, a quick explanation of how forum works on the first day, so to contrast this new strange thing that forums turn out to be for them. And as for the question and answer sessions, they were appreciated too, and they said that they appreciated the fact of having been divided into smaller groups for the training itself. And they would have preferred even smaller groups, but in any case, the number of participants for each session wasn't a problem. We had up to 10 participants of the total 50 for each session, and it still was good. We have been able to have all of them talking and asking questions or showing us what they were doing. So it was important because it was one of the most live parts in which we have been able to exchange, to have a conversation with them, because in the other live sessions it was mainly us who were talking and then we were listening. So these were really important for being able to talk with them and not only to them. And apparently they say that they would have preferred to have more of these kind of question and answer sessions. So not just 2 as we did, but at least 1 per day. So this is something that we could improve in future workshops. And generally about the synchronous versus asynchronous approach, of course, having been together would have been nicer. But generally it was very good for trainees from different time zones. So of course we were not able to cover all the world time zones, but we had people from 3 different continents, and it was so having the sessions at different times for the question and answer sessions, and adding all the other sessions, live sessions at midday in Europe was good also for people from America and Australia, for being able to follow the live parts. And of course, having all the other teaching parts asynchronously allowed all of them to watch them at whatever time they preferred. So just to have an overview on the asynchronous approach, generally it proved to be very more flexible than a synchronous one, and it was fitting almost all time zones, and particularly it was fitting everyone's learning needs and timing. So not only the times of the day in which to watch videos and do exercises, but also to give them the possibility of watching the videos more than once and listen again to something if they had missed a part, and so allowing them to not miss anything from what we taught. And one of the greatest advantages was, as we said before, to have less consecutive screen hours, and consequently also to have an apparently less intense program, because the contents were the same, but distributed in this way, they appear to be less intense and so more easily to understand and to follow. And it was compatible also with our simultaneous approach, simultaneous commitment, which is something that we do not recommend when someone does a week-long workshop. They should be focusing on it, but let's say in cases in which someone would have not registered to a workshop because he knows that he has something very important that he cannot miss. In this case, having the possibility of watching the videos, doing the exercises at whatever time of the day, this is compatible also with other kind of commitments. And something more, very important is the fact that it proved to be more empowering. And it was, this approach was really encouraging self-reliance, because without having us all the hours of the workshop, and specifically having to do the exercises by themselves, this really helped them to search the guidelines by themselves and really think about what to do. And this is something that we really noticed in the questions that they had either on the forums or in the live Q&A sessions. The level of the questions that they had was very, very high, very higher than usual. So apparently they were able to learn more and better than in previous experiences, at least compared to other workshops in which I taught in the past. And of course, there were some cons, and the two main ones were that globally there was a minor sense of closeness compared to asynchronous approach, because we weren't there all the time. And the worst part of it, let's say, is the fact that there was less supervised practical training. But this is something that could be improved with having more sessions, more Q&A sessions, at least one per day, or even more if necessary. So just to end my presentation, I would like to say that I don't know what's happening here. I would like to add that being able to experience directly both approaches, it was really useful, because there was something good in both of them. So there are some parts of the synchronous workshop that I think it would be useful to carry on, but also some parts of the new approaches that we experienced for the first time in the last week workshop that should be kept for the future. So we hope to come to I won't say perfect, but to an improved way of doing workshops, which has some of the best part of both approaches. And I thank you for listening, and I will leave the floor to Monica.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yes, Gabby wants to add something. Or Alice.
I just wanted to add very, very briefly on the subject of the feedback that we received. Firstly, that we only got provisional feedback so far, that Irene is talking about, and secondly that you may have the impression from the feedback that Irene gave that that this was unanimous responses to things and so forth, whereas actually the people who were utterly horrified by the forum and said that we're classicists, we can't use a digital forum, were three people, right? And there were many people who did use the forum. So it wasn't that the forum was unusable. It was useful feedback. It helped us to make the forum more usable in the second half of the week. And we would, in future workshops, we would maybe start with a training session saying, just 5 minutes, here's a demonstration of how to use the forum, which, couldn't hurt. But I don't think anyone was confounded by the forum entirely. I mean, it was, and similarly for other things, for every person who said, I really hated X, there was someone else who said, no, I quite liked it. So there was, there was a mix of responses. Yeah.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And I think that your enthusiasm speaks a lot, because I know that. So you have been teaching these workshops and sessions. It can be exhausting, but from your enthusiasm, I can see that you were successful. So, okay, so I don't know if you have to add other things, or if we can start the discussion. Okay, so I think we can start a discussion. So we have people in the chat in YouTube, and we have a first question about yes, okay. Well, no, it's not a naive question. Okay, does epigraphy only deal with Greek and Latin inscriptions? Well, certainly not. The thing is that yes, our program focuses a lot on Greek and Latin because it was developed as a digital classics program because we are classicists, but we always try to include other languages, of course, and definitely epigraphy is also about other languages. And next week, for example, we will have a session about a corpus built at the Brown University from Israel and Palestine, where we will see not only Greek and Latin inscription, but also Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions, for example. But there are, of course, many other languages. And what we have been trying to do in Sunoikis is to show how to use technologies in general for dealing with historical languages, and so epigraphy in different languages. And also these activities, of course, were focused on Greek and Latin, but the use of certain methods, including epidoc, can be applied to other languages. So to answer this question,
I would just add to that in many ways, it's a fair question, because epidoc, the way we described it, very much started as a system for dealing with Greek and Latin epigraphy, and I may have described epidoc as, you know, having also addressed some other epigraphies, you know, as an afterthought. So it certainly, you know, has that impression. Epidoc is now very, very explicitly not just a Greco-Roman epigraphy project. The word epigraphy is used in many other disciplines, not in every single discipline that involves things written on stone, but in many. There are epidoc projects, core epidoc projects, working in early Arabic inscriptions, with cuneiform inscriptions, Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions, Southeast Asian inscriptions, South Asian inscriptions in Sanskrit and other languages, Maya inscriptions. So there's all sorts of projects that are working in epidoc that are not just interesting comparative uses; they're core to how epidoc works now. So I think it's a very fair question, and if you'd asked that question 10 years ago, it would have been a bit harder to answer quite, you know, in that way. So quite so honestly, we'd have had to say, you know, yes, actually epidoc is a bit geared towards Greek and Latin, not much else. But now I think it's much more widely used.
I may add that next event of the Encode project in Hamburg is going to deal with Ethiopic inscriptions and manuscripts connected with linked open data. So that's another field of application of epidoc.
Yes, thank you. Yes, we have different applications, and that's the good thing about digital epigraphy. So try to connect different communities. Of course, every one of us has an expertise. We can't deal with everything. It's not possible, but there is now a connection, because this is important. We have our fields, our expertise, but we need always to be in touch with other communities working on other languages to see how we can share methods. This is fundamental for the sustainability of our projects in general. So this is important. So thank you for this question. Then I see, okay, in the chat, other comments and questions. And we have Anise from Brazil. Okay, thank you. And your comment about, yes, a Greek intro language distance course between 2004 and 6, which were entirely asynchronous at the time. So well before the pandemic. So it's good to see. Yes, Gabby, please.
That's an excellent point, and I would just comment on that when I started, so, you know, almost a year ago, realizing that everything was going to have to be, you know, delivered online for the foreseeable future, I started thinking about and talking with my colleagues about how we were going to teach these sorts of things. The first people I spoke to were people in distance learning who do a lot of language teaching, but other kinds of things. There's a very, very large distance learning program at the University of London. In fact, it's about 5 or 10 times bigger than our in-person teaching program at the University of London. And they said, oh, well, here's all the sort of things we've been doing forever. And a lot of them were like, oh, yeah, I thought of that. Yeah, I thought of that. Yeah, that's what I was hoping to do. That's what we do in SunoikisIS already. That's, that was all, I felt very happy. And then the other thing is, do it all asynchronously. What are you even thinking? Do it asynchronously. And that was the idea of doing everything asynchronously was something that hadn't occurred to me and my colleagues at the time. So I think that the learning from distance learning, and particularly language learning, has been very, very valuable to us. Yeah.
Yes, and we can say that in the end, distance learning is not just so recent, because there are many projects started in the past, including, I have to say, the original SunoikisIS, because they started, well, about 20 years ago with other technologies. I'm old enough to remember asynchronous teaching on TV when I was a very young student. There were also courses in archaeology, and so is an old activity. Of course, now we have new technologies that help us. And okay, so well, now I would like also to go back to your presentations, and thank you, Alice and Irene, for sharing numbers, statistics, and feedback. And this is also the aim of this session. So please, now or later on YouTube, you can ask your questions and send us a feedback. So this is the reason why we wanted this session, to see where we are. Of course, we are in a specific historical moment due to the pandemic, but in any case, distance learning is something that we have been doing a lot. And so to see those statistics, especially for a discipline like epigraphy, which is a specific discipline, certainly, but those numbers were interesting. And in general, online teaching, distance teaching, especially for epigraphy, of course, there is an issue, which is working with objects. So definitely you need to visit a museum to have a sense of those objects. Today we have many pictures online. We have many videos, so we can live this experience in Google Arts. We can visit museums. I was showing a week ago to my students the possibility to visit the Acropolis Museum, for example. But of course, this is not the same thing as visiting a museum and really concretely work with an inscription. And this is why a few years ago we also had a few sessions from Thasos in Greece, thanks to the L'École Française. We could go to Thasos and work in the museum. So yes, and this is where we needed to find strategies for combining online teaching and physical experiences in a museum. So please, Gabby, yes.
Just to add that I absolutely agree that most of what we're teaching digitally, or things that you experience digitally, such as virtual museums and so forth, are, you have to say they're not the real thing. They're not doing it in person. In many ways, they're inferior to less adequate than going there in person. But there are things that you can do digitally that you can't do in person. Visiting a museum, for example, you can see things in the virtual museum that are just not on display in the real museum, or that gallery is closed, or that you can't get very close to them because there's too many people, or because there's glass in the way, whereas they can have really good images online. There's, with teaching, there are things you can do. You can pause a video, you can't pause your lecturer. There's well, you sort of can, but people get annoyed if you keep doing it. So there are things that we can, as we've all said, that we can learn from this method, and even just visiting museums. Virtual museums are also really good for museums, not just good for us. They're really good for museums to get people familiar with the content, to get people excited about the content. That then once they open again, they will come and visit in person. So I think there's, we have to be a little bit careful not just to say, obviously it's not as good as really going to the Acropolis Museum. You're right, of course it's not. But there are also things that we can't do in the Acropolis Museum.
No, I totally agree. And this is the thing. So we have to learn how to combine these experiences. So going to the museum and then at the same time leaving the museum on the screen with a virtual visit, and then how to learn how to, for example, work with objects, with pictures. This is the reason why we have been teaching a lot. So how to use pictures of inscriptions, what we can do with them, if we can reuse them or not. So in the past, we knew that we couldn't take pictures in a museum and republish them, but now there are many other issues. So that's the challenge, to combine these things. Of course, now we are in a difficult situation due to the pandemic, but we are learning even more than before. So how to combine both experiences. On the other side, especially for young students, go to the museum. Just not sit in front of your screen. Use online resources, but then go to the museum. So you need both experiences. Then I don't know if you have other comments also, and Irene, of course. You can say more about this. And it was also funny to read the comments in Italian from your students. So this idea, well, I can understand that to combine epigraphy, the traditional part and the digital part can be exhausting, also for us in our research. I can see now the work is more than before because we have to produce data. So in general, and this is another thing we have to learn, to combine, not only to learn, we have to learn epigraphy, but also computer science, or at least digital technologies. Definitely, yes, we have more work than before, and definitely this is something that we could read in the comments of your students. And then the other thing, to svecchiare. I'm sorry, I use the Italian verb because we can translate it, but not really. So to make this discipline younger. Well, yes, and this is maybe where we have to work. So epigraphy, yes, definitely is a discipline about the past. But we have also epigraphy today. When in our cities we have a form of urban epigraphy, we can see many inscriptions, but also recent inscriptions, contemporary inscriptions. So epigraphy, of course, our epigraphy is about the past, but is an activity that we still have. So I think that comment was interesting, but this is the perception that our students have, and so there is a lot of work that we have to do. But the challenge is to combine both. So my dream is to have students learning computer science and at the same time learning the past, the Greek and Latin, and vice versa. This is something that maybe will happen, which is happening in your courses, in your workshops, but maybe in the future it will be possible really to expand this also to high schools, for example, where can we really combine both disciplines. So there are many possibilities for the future. Yes. So we still have a few minutes, 8-9 minutes. Yes, please, Gabby.
I think talking about contemporary epigraphy is actually a really valuable part of talking about epigraphy. It's so, you know, our students usually know, you know, what epigraphy is in as much as they can picture a stone with writing on it. But just talking about why it's important, what we learn from it, all those sorts of things, using contemporary epigraphy as an example for that. I started a few years ago, and it sort of fell by the wayside, and I'd like to carry on, but collecting a Flickr folder of photographs of modern inscriptions that needed emendation. Right, so we could, you know, we could show them to students before they have to worry about doing this in Greek or Latin. They'd say, well, what's wrong with this? Well, obviously, you can see, you know, what was the stonecutter drunk? Was the stonecutter very cheap? You know, what was the issue? Did they run out of space? You know, did they add something later? Did they remove something? You know, all these sort of things that you can see in thing, and it's things that we do explain to our students, and we address them ourselves, but looking at it and getting them to just look at the inscription and say, well, see what's happening here. There was a sign down my street which someone had hand painted on the wall, no parking, okay? And they'd written no parking, and they'd run out of space for the G. So they wrote the G underneath. That happens in inscriptions all the time. what better way to explain it than to say, well, here, look at this. You know exactly what happened there. You know, I didn't see the guy painting it, but I could even see the expression on his face when he realized he got to the end line to run out of room. And then he painted the letter underneath. You know, these, it's using the contemporary. So I was, the other day, my mother, as she occasionally does, asked me what it is I do when I study. And normally when she or other people who are not academics ask me this, I talk about some aspect of digital humanities, and I talk about, you know, what it is I do, and I get very excited and I talk about it, and I spend 10 minutes explaining what it is I do, and then they say, that sounds really nice, but I didn't understand anything. So this time I thought, okay, this time I'm not going to let that be the answer. So instead I said, I do epigraphy, and I explained epigraphy by talking about modern inscriptions and what you can learn from them. I didn't mention ancient Roman inscriptions once. And, you know, it was, you know, for the first time, someone understood what I was saying when I said what I do, which was, you know, I think it's a really useful model for, you know, it's a medium for explaining and helping to understand. If you don't need to explain anything, show a picture of that inscription with the G underneath the rest of the line and ask people what's going on there. They will know.
Yes, exactly. And then we have many other examples. Graffiti in our cities still, of course, everywhere we can find them, and they express a need of people to various needs, of course. We can agree with them or not, but in any case, it's interesting. They are a form of epigraphy in some way. So yes, there are many interesting connections also with the modern and the contemporary world. So yes. Okay, so I don't know if we have other comments. So I wasn't really impressed by, I participated at the beginning in January in your workshop, and then I see that you have been doing many things, so it's great to see. And also I like this acronym, ENCODE as a word, but this is also an acronym, so enhanced competencies, okay, in digital epigraphy, which is really the big question we have today. What kind of competencies we want to achieve, and we want our students to achieve, and these programs are an excellent example of the work that we have been doing in the community, okay, to define these competencies. And I know it's difficult for a young student, not only for young students, but also for us, okay, to have more competencies and to define them, especially for academic programs. But there is a lot of work now, and also the pandemic in some way helped us to focus more on this. But again, these technologies helped us in the pandemic for obvious reasons, but these programs were conceived and were born before the pandemic, and not just for this situation like this. And the goal is to combine all these activities, okay, synchronous and asynchronous, and of course, activities in class, in a museum, but also online. So this is something that started some years ago, and beyond the pandemic. So still 3 minutes, I'm checking the chat. So I thank our audience. So we had a number of people in the audience today. I'm very happy about that. And also for your comments in the chat. So thank you for this. And also we have, okay, in the class outlines in GitHub, we have also an exercise, and you can try to encode, okay, inscriptions, and you can access to corpora, okay, the Greek and Roman inscriptions from Vagionakis. So you have these online collections online. You can use those texts, and also you have a clear description, so you can experiment with encoding. And you also have, this is the thing. So if you are new to Epidoc, in any case, you have many examples, many files online already encoded, where you can see how you can use Epidoc to solve specific problems and to encode inscriptions. Okay, so I think that, okay, our classes now is over. We have 2 minutes, but I think that now we can finish. So I thank Alice, Irene, and Gabby for this session. It was really a nice discussion. And again, we wanted, considering this time, considering the pandemic, we want to summarize a bit where we are today in 2021, looking beyond the pandemic, hopefully, of course, and then also to present this new project. And as we could see, of course, this project is based on a long experiences, also Alice showed at the beginning, because in Bologna, but also in London, of course, epigraphy is a discipline, is a well-established discipline with a long tradition and experience, which is important. But now we have this new project, which is really an Erasmus Plus project, which is super interesting for asking questions about new competencies for our students. So, okay, our time now is over. Thank you very much for this session. Thanks to the audience. Next week, we will have again another session about epigraphy. In that case, we will focus on a corpus, on a project developed at Brown University for working with inscriptions from Israel and Palestine. And we will see not only Greek and Latin inscriptions, but also Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions. And then the following week, we will have a third session about epigraphy. In that case, we will see how to use computational linguistics for annotating inscriptions. So how to use that technology for annotating the language of inscriptions. Okay, definitely there will be a focus on Greek and Latin, but again, the session will be on the methods, okay, how to use computational linguistics for epigraphy. Okay, so thank you. I wish you a good night for those of you who are in our time zone, or otherwise a good day, a nice week, and see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.
See you all next week.